Let's start with a quiz. Can everybody raise a hand? Now, put a finger down if you've ever thought that a coworker was lazy or unreliable because they call in sick to work all the time. Put a finger down if you ever think that people with mental illnesses are dangerous or violent during a psychotic break. Put a finger down if you think people with mental illnesses are incapable of making their own decisions or holding certain positions. Put a finger down if you've ever dismissed someone's worries because the worry doesn't seem that bad and they should be able to just shake it off. Put a finger down if you've ever thought that someone is unintelligent because they have a hard time focusing or completing basic tasks. If you've put a finger down to any of these prompts, then you might be contributing to mental health stigma. Stigma refers to the disapproval or shame that society has towards mental illness, and it encompasses a wide variety of negative attitudes and stereotypes about mental illness. Stigma is structural and systemic, which means that it is so widespread, we might not even believe or realize that we hold certain attitudes about mental illness. For example, let's imagine a person, and we'll call her Mary. Mary has generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder. Now, let's say we work with Mary, and she's been going through a hard time, so she's been calling in sick to work a lot. It's pretty common for many of us to think, well, she's lazy or unreliable or a bad team player. Maybe we even know about her disorders, and we still think, why can't she just shake it off and come to work? Or she's complaining about the stress of her life, but my life is also stressful. These attitudes are examples of stigma. And what's critical is that these attitudes reinforce intolerance and prejudice against mental illness, which is why it is critical that we start to assess our own implicit beliefs to break down stigma. In my research, I want to answer the question, why does stigma exist? With each passing year, we as a society become more and more aware about mental illness and how many people experience it. So in general, the more that we learn about something, we tend to dispel the false beliefs that we might hold. So if we're more aware than ever about mental illness and how many people it affects, then why does stigma persist? What mechanisms might be reinforcing it so that it is difficult for us to assess and break down? We are in a mental health crisis. Therefore, it is critical that we start to understand not only more about mental illness, but more about the stigma that surrounds it. I will share some ways that a critical disability perspective can shed light on the way that mental health is stigmatized and misunderstood by society. According to disability scholars, an impairment is the physical or mental affliction that a person's body or mind experiences, whereas disability refers to the disabling effects of society because someone has an impairment. Therefore, mental illness is a disability, just like paraplegia or blindness. The mental impairment causes individuals to be disabled in society. Therefore, we can gain some useful insights about mental illness from a disability perspective. I think it can help us understand why stigma of mental illness persists, why increasing social awareness through things like Bell Let's Talk simply isn't enough to dismantle stigma. The first mechanism I'll discuss is called looping effects. Negative attitudes that society holds about mental illness can shape how a person with mental illness sees themselves. When someone is classified or labeled as belonging to a category, for example, because they have a mental health diagnosis, they will tend to see themselves as belonging to these categories, and they might take on the expectations that society has associated with that category. Because stigma is structural and systemic, these beliefs are everywhere. So if society holds negative attitudes about a specific mental illness, then someone with that mental illness might believe those attitudes and reenact them themselves. For example, if Mary thinks that people with depression are lazy and unreliable, since she has depression, she might think, I must also be lazy and unreliable. She will see herself negatively according to these stereotypes, even though these are not accurate descriptions of how she is as a person. When people are labeled, they can see themselves according to that label. And if the label is stigmatized, then someone might internalize the stigma, reenact these attitudes, which thus reinforces the stigma in the first place. However, it's important to note, looping effects can also impair a person's ability to resist stigma. Stigma prevents individuals from viewing themselves positively, and thus it impairs that person's autonomy. Autonomy is one's ability to act in accordance with their own values, beliefs, and preferences. However, acting autonomously or acting freely requires that a person see themselves as capable and confident and able to act as they wish. Thus, if someone constantly feels devalued because of society's stigma, they may fail to live with enough confidence and resilience to deflect and challenge the stigma held against them. If we consider Mary again, she might not feel confident in her own ability to go to university or apply for her dream job. In fact, she might feel so poorly about herself because of the negative stigma that she might not even feel worthy of asking for or receiving help for her mental illness. Categorizing people with stigmatized labels perpetuates stigma when these stereotypes are internalized, because people are unable to build enough confidence and resilience and self-trust to act as they wish and thus resist the stigma. But what about when people might not have a formal diagnosis yet, or maybe they don't see themselves as belonging specifically to the category of mentally ill? The second reason I propose for why stigma persists can be explained by the disability concept of compulsory able-bodiedness, or in our case, compulsory able-mindedness. I will combine both of these terms, however, to be inclusive to disabilities of both body and mind by using the term compulsory able-body-mindedness. I've decided to put this up on the screen because I realize that this term is a bit of a mouthful. This term describes how society makes identities, such as having a healthy, young body and mind, seem natural or normal. When an identity is so idealized by society, any identity that deviates from it is considered abnormal and inferior, even when it's not. So, because having a disabled body and mind is viewed as worse than having an able one, there is stigma associated with being disabled. There is immense privilege in being able to live and work according to the demands that society expects of you. So much so that people want to prove that they should not be associated with the stigmatized category, even though it is impossible for all of us at all times to keep up these unachievable norms of being perfectly healthy and able. What is even more challenging about striving for an able body or mind at all times is that disability will affect every single one of us if we live long enough. The Canadian Mental Health Association states that 1 in 5 people in Canada will personally experience a mental disorder. And by the age of 40, 50% of the population will have or have had a mental illness. This prevalence explains the compulsory part of compulsory able-bodiedness. We must feel like we have to perform in accordance with certain norms expected of us. And it is in our best interest to act as if we have a healthy, able body or mind, even if we do not. This idea is helpful for understanding why stigma of mental illness persists, because people who have some sort of mental illness might try to hide their diagnosis to avoid being treated inferiorly or discriminated against. So, stigma persists because we do not have examples of people in our lives that are openly discussing their disorder, explaining their challenges, and, more importantly, disrupting the stigma associated with mental illness. If people are afraid of challenging and resisting the negative attitudes associated with their condition, then we will never be able to dismantle the stigma. Coming out as someone with a mental illness is a brave step that is necessary for society to see how stigma does not accurately describe the people associated with the label. A disability perspective can help us understand how and why stigma has persisted, despite our increasing social awareness of mental illness. What I argued is that the very nature of stigma allows itself to be perpetuated. Stigma is more than negative attitudes and stereotypes against mental illness, because it affects people who are victim to these stereotypes. As I explained, these individuals might either act according to the looping effects and internalize the negative attitudes about them, or they try to hide their diagnosis because they don't want to be discriminated against. Either way, stigma prevents people with mental illnesses from resisting these false attitudes, which thus continues and reinforces the harmful cycle of stigma. We need a drastic way to break this cycle. It would be difficult, if not highly unethical, to expect people with mental illnesses to single-handedly resist the stigma and challenge society's stereotypes. Therefore, I believe it is our responsibility, the responsibility of every one of us who has an idea of what mental illness looks like or acts like, to critically assess our beliefs about mental illness. It is our responsibility to try to rise above these problematic beliefs and help people with mental illness see themselves positively. This allows them to have the resilience and autonomy to resist stigma and feel confident in their own self-worth. If we want to break the barriers that restrain those who are stigmatized, we need to find ways to promote and support their autonomy. By envisioning and striving for an inclusive and accessible society, we can empower persons with mental illness to resist stigma, knowing that they have supportive allies who are there to help. So, I ask, are you contributing to stigma? If so, how are you going to change your thoughts, attitudes, and actions to rise above it?